an entire enemy dedicated to being nothing more than an Easter egg. The kicker skeleton the enemy wears a red scarf and attacks by leaping into the air with its arms outstretched, then delivering a flying kick. These two elements, Mups and the Beatmania frames named after Konami's series of music games. The former offers rapid shots, while the original Bokai refer to games published by Konami. These are the Gradius, named after the series of side-scrolling shoot, wearable red scarf and ancient belt items. The ancient belt alludes to the many belts that give the common riders, reference the Japanese superhero Kamen Rider, who's known for his flying kick finishing move and his red scarf if S. A franchise in the game, the player can acquire the skull suit, which lets players sneak by enemies more effectively in latterfires, shots that make loud sounds on impact. Bokai 2 also has a sneaky reference to the Metal Gear of references. The Bokai games, for example, are overflowing with references to other Konami titles. 2 solar gun frames in their powers, its description explains that it lun the wearer. A positive attitude, a reference to Conrider Cougar, whose belt. The Aal was not only an artifact from an ancient civilization, but who's also characterized by his unusually upbeat and optimistic personality. The ancient belt items, box-like design, also mirrors Conrider Black Bell, the Kingstone. Ironically, neither Con. We translated issue 84 of Nintendo Dream magazine into English for the first time, and talked about some of its contents in a video, all about the third generation of Pokémon games. The interview included Junichi, Muda, and Ken Suuki. Rider Black nor Conrider Cougar wore scarves. Unlike many of the early riders, Konami clearly loves making these sorts. Metal Gear Solid 2. The sneaking suit worn by Raiden during the Big Shell incident was also known as the Skull Suit due to its appearance. And now it's time for our last piece of exclusive GBA trivia last year. Mori uncovered things like how Blazin was designed to look ugly and how Slacko got motivated when it evolved. We left aside just for a rainy day. One of these facts is how much the team struggled to stay into Vigoroth, then decided the effort wasn't worth it, and evolved into slacking. But there's a few more facts that motivated during development in the interview. Masuda states that, partly due to having a development team of 30 after 2, and they all had to psych themselves up for work by shouting, "Come on, let's do this," and the process. Years. They all started to lose steam. Devs would regularly ask how much longer till we can say we're finished. Of making the Pokemon designs themselves seems to have been demoralizing too. Shugamori mentions how a lot of the Pokemon put them into playable builds mid-development, then he'd get feedback from testers in Nintendo's Super Mario Club that the creatures had a troubled development, as art director Shigemori would finalize all the Pokemon made by other members of staff, so that the Pokédex was consistent, but there were points where he didn't have them all unified yet, and had to know that you don't need to keep saying it. That was pretty draining spiritually. The basic designs were there, but they lacked polish, and the testers would point it out constantly. The Game Boy Advance brought us some amazing 2D, didn't look like Pokemon. Sugimori said there was a long period where I felt like, today's portable systems that may seem hard to believe for some of our younger viewers was as laughable as it may seem. The idea of having more than just a few colours on screen was pretty impressive at the time. Titles, and impressively even some 3D ones. The Advance truly pushed the portable gaming scene though, with the standard of, even if they were hard to see, thanks to the original Game Boy Advance lacking a backlight. Luckily Nintendo recognized this fault and released the Game Boy Advance SP, which is still among one of their best portable devices to this day, taking up a ridiculously compact form factor, looking pretty damn spicy, if we do say so ourselves. Of course, any good system needs good games, and the Game Boy Advance had them and drove many ports, hit the system like the Donkey Kong Country series, but new franchises also came along like Golden Sunday, and of course Nintendo would release new entries for Mario, Metroid, and Pokémon. We'll start by going over Donkey Kong Country's releases, as Rare didn't just simply port the titles over, they actually gave them some new features in Donkey Kong Country. 3 Rare included a bunch of extra minigames as post-game content. What makes these minigames genuinely interesting, however, is that they're all based on an earlier and lesser known Rare title for the NES titled Cobra Triangle. Cobra Triangle was a 1,989 racing vehicular combat game where players control a weapon-equipped speedboat through 25 levels with various objectives such as score for the Donkey Kong Country series, but of course the original Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy, as winning races, saving swimmers and defusing bombs. Cobra Triangle music was notably created by David Wise, who also helmed. Advance also had some new touches. When the player enters Cranky's cabin, a few reference to other Rare games can be seen scattered around as well. Mumbo Jumbo's mask from Banjo-Kazooie is sitting on a barrel in the foreground. Tsar Wolf from the Game Boy Advance game of the same name has his head mounted on the wall, and a barely distinguishable picture on the wall is apparently the cast of Rare's Xbox title grabbed by the Ghoulies though. It's probably safe to say that not many people really noticed this one. Speaking of Rare, we recently talked about Banjo Pilot in our every cancelled Game Boy Advance game video, and how the game was once Diddy Kong Pilot but was heavily reworked after Rare was purchased by Microsoft. One thing we didn't mention in that video, however, was how an early build of the game actually featured a number of playable Mario characters. The characters in question were Mario, Peach, Yoshi, Wario, Bowser, and Toad, and they even had their own unique planes, whether the initial plans to lend these characters for a third-party developed racing game. When they are all prominently featured in Mario Kart, what's included having these characters appear as playable characters is unknown, but it's very likely that Nintendo would have been reluctant. Funny, however, is that considering the demo was Diddy Kong Pilot, the roster of this early build actually features more Centric. So let's take a quick detour to look at a game in the Mario, or rather Wario series warrant, Centric. So let's take a quick detour to look at a game in the Mario, or rather Wario series warrant. The first track of an audio sample compilation CD called Zero G's Vocal XTC, which involved a variety of lines delivered more advanced audio vocals, were actually used for the game's title track and ending sequence, something that wouldn't have been an option for handheld games. Before the Game Boy Advance released, part of the vocals were actually taken from Come Here I Come, Look Out Here I Come. This line was cut up and used in the Warren 4. Delivered more advanced audio vocals were actually used for the game's title track and ending sequence, something that wouldn't have Come Here I Come, Look Out Here I Come. This line was cut up and used in the Warand 4 and didn't receive much attention from anywhere besides the Mario Wiki. Another title on the Game Boy Advance starring Mario seemed to many people as a bit of a strange game at the time of its release, seemingly coming out, and didn't receive much attention from anywhere besides the Mario Wiki. Another title on the Game Boy Advance starring Mario decided to create a demo consisting of what they figured would be the first and last areas of the game. A bull, Adrian Barrett and Richard Hawkes, 2 developers with a track record of having created several successful pinball games. A bull, Adrian Barrett and Richard Hawkes, 2 developers with a track record of having created several successful pinball games. Studio was allowed to work on a Mario game. They decided to develop the title for the Game Boy Advance. Decided to create a demo consisting of what they figured would be the first and last areas of the game. Seemed to many people as a bit of a strange game at the time of its release. Seemingly coming out, Studio was allowed to work on a Mario game. they decided to develop the title for the Game Boy Advance, rather than the GameCube, as Fuse Games team had somewhat limited resources, and because of the system similarity, it eased to, but eventually the land was added, likely to give the game's name a bit more flair and fit the name. More comfortable hardware for the developers. The SNES Mario Pinball was the studio's first commercial project, taking 18 months to develop with a staff of just 5 people in total. Initially the game was developed with the title Mario Pinball, of convention of handheld Mario titles, going back to another rare developed title, Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. Actually went through a number of changes during development, read from an early prototype version of the game. A particular note, the developers shaved off 17th of the game's total notes, and Jiggy's reducing the total from 700 notes to 670, Jiggy's to 60. Paul R., a former programmer for the game, has spoken as well about how red feathers were removed from the game entirely, which would have given the player the ability to fly. He claims that the reason were also said to be included, but were cut from the final release, with a UFO-type character appearing in scenery, collision detection, extending above the object on older maps, creating invisible walls and making movement extremely frustrating. Some characters, the game's prototype, which isn't found in the retail, release a character not just set to have movement, graphics, but for their removal was because of numerous complaints about the feature, including the camera's deceiving perspective and some issues with a dialogue icon suggesting a more involved role than just an enemy in the retail cartridge, is a set of to appear at some point. It's unknown why he was removed. While some games had lots of changes, others struggled to make any at all. For Metroid Fusion, Spacefaring, Bounty Hunter, Sasaran got a new look, game director, and graphics, which go unused as well, revealing that at some stage Bogey, a recurring character in the series, was going. Writer Yoshi Sakamoto revealed in a 2003 interview that the first designers he handed the project to came back. Changing the design of the hero of the game is a big deal, right? They were going to really need, with the outrageous desire to change Samus's design. He stated, "It's been the same way for way too long, but to convince us, even though Samus's design from Super Smash Bros. Was popular, it was still no small thing to deliberately change her traditional Metroid design. That's why I told them that if they were going to change it, they'd need to introduce some new element and a good justification for it. I told the team that deliberately changing Samus's get them thinking about new gameplay elements they could introduce, and the necessity of having a solid reasoning game is a stripped-down version of Samus's classic power suit, after the suit's organic parts bonded to her body with fur. Doing so, this resulted in the creation of the fusion suit, giving Samus a new blue edge. The suit design was nothing to take lightly, so rather than have them thinking about simply changing her design, I tried to the majority of it being surgically removed during the game's opening. Another title that was crafted with lots of love was the much beloved JRPG Golden Sun. When it came to designing the world within the game, it's not all too surprising that the inspiration for landmasses came from the real world around us when exploring the world of Weird. You may have noticed that continents such as Gondan bear a remarkably similar geography and culture to Africa. Even the supercontinent that incorporated Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, and the regions of India and the Arabian Peninsula, other regions, name of Gondan, is likely a reference to the origins of the continent, Gondwana land, or Gondwana was the ancient continental East Asia, and the Near East Indra has similarities to India, Oenia being similar to Oceania and Australia Hesperia. Of Golden Sun's world reference locations in the real world too, with Angara being similar to Europe, as well as is inhabited by people resembling the North American native. American Zateca takes on similarities to South America, and Tandara is a frigid cold land not dissimilar to Antarctica. And while we're talking about beloved RPGs, let's jump over to a much talked about game, Pokémon Emerald. Although Emerald and Generation 3 in general have been talked about to death, the game still has a few secrets that aren't all that well known. One interesting tidbit is that the order that your rival, either Brendan or May, sends out their Pokémon during battle is entirely determined by which gender they are, and by extension is also determined by which gender the player chose for their own character before their adventure even effects. If they chose Torchic or Mudkip, the Game Boy Advance has so many good games on it, and they started, however, for reasons unknown. This only works if the starter the rival chose was Trio, and doesn't come into even manage to outlast the console that they were made for, thanks to Nintendo's keen interest in backwards compatibility to enjoy the backlog of games released for the GBA, a godsend for many, particularly those strapped for cash, as their handheld systems, the Nintendo DS, gave players access to not just the newest DS title, but they could continue. Having a new system that could play older games means the legacy of some of the Game Boy Advance's most iconic titles could live on with those who have a tight budget or who were simply curious about the past, own incredibly distinct cast of supporting characters, and leaving players with no mistakes that Wario is a comedic element of. Inc. Mega Micro Games was a pretty dramatic change for Wario's position within Nintendo's library of games, giving him his and Four Swords, Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, and even Pokémon's pinball spin-off. These are just some of the titles pretty well hidden, such as one reference that requires some extra effort one may not think to put in after the Mario franchise, that humour can be found throughout WarioWare and ranges from being on the nose to being, as we'll be talking about in this episode with our first smash landing in the world of microgame mania WarioWare. Clearing the first set of Wario's microgames, the player can then play them again endlessly. Doing so means that they could try out great games like WarioWare, Castlevania, Circle of the Moon, Fire Emblem, Zelda, the Minish Cap, Legend of Zelda series, while pressing the right direction will change them into the GameCube logo. Instead, another series that the player can repeatedly beat the boss of this stage, which will present them with a short animation of Wario by pressing the A button, revealing what Wario is watching after beating the boss. On the third difficulty cycle, the Staff RLE, which lets the player change the shape of stars that fly past the screen through button inputs. If of the late Nintendo president Satur A, but this isn't the game's only secret, another reference comes in during the words "Thank you for playing" appears instead of rest, and by turning on the television, a smartly dressed businessman with another earlier title released by the publisher. Both this time around, some players may have never even known the game. Resting on a sofa watching television, it's actually possible for the player to turn the television on during this animation. Made quite the impression on GBA is Konami's Castlevania series, and Circle of the Moon has its own reference to the player press down the down button on the game's controller. The stars will turn into small triforces from the... They were referencing a wearable item dropped by the skeleton medalist. Is the bear ring a ring which the game glasses will be revealed? Though this isn't of course just any businessman, it is in fact the great iconic visage, providing them with a loss of 100 strength, defense, intelligence and luck, suggesting the player shouldn't use it for lack. Turn into a cartoonish dream bear called Bear Tank. Bear Tank is actually a character that appeared in an earlier, so he's not too recognizable to us audiences, but he has made appearances in other Konami titles as well, including set-up combination of Pluto and Black Dog. Rather than the usual effect of turning into a skeleton, they will instead of any real benefit. However, if the player does equip this item at the same time as activating the duel, Konami title Rakuga Kids, a 2.5D fighting game released for the Nintendo 64 in 1998. We actually covered the game. Konami title Rakuga Kids, a 2.5D fighting game released for the Nintendo 64 in 1998. We actually covered the game. Konami, Crazy Races for GBA. This transformation in Circle of the Moon is considered to actually still be pretty useless, as though it does have some unique and rather interesting attacks. His damage is still well below that of Nathan's joke, but as a lover of the bear tank, we can't say it's an unwelcome one. Another series of games which had little acknowledgement overseas is the legendary Stafy series, probably as a result of most of the games in human form, and he will die in just a single blow. In reality, this item is nothing more than a for the Game Boy all the way back in 1995, before eventually having development move to the Game Boy Color, the series never getting an international release. The first game, Densetsu no Stafy, originally began its life being developed in 1998 before it was shifted once again, shortly before its completion to the new GBA hardware in 1999-9, is reset. And although it's less of an Easter egg, the player can also enter down, down, up, up, left, the title screen, which now says Super Enable All. Speaking of Konami Easter eggs, Castlevania Aura of Sorrow actually has player can also enter the combination left, left, right, right, down, down, A. This will change the logo to say right, left, right, BA. The opposite of the Konami code to unlock everything in the game. This will change, is reset, and although it's less of an Easter egg, the player can also enter down, down, up, up, left, super block mode, which you might have guessed makes the entire game look blockier. This effect persists until the game, super nice try. Instead of Super Monkey Ball Jun, this button combination is of course the code, army code, the up, up, down, down, left, right, BA at the title screen. The game's logo will change to say up, up, down, down, left, right, BA at the title screen. The game's logo will change to say of the passwords, except for K, exclamation mark, are 6 characters or less, compared to the 7 character passwords used. Ziggler, Xavier, Jack and Michael Ken. Some other games have secret passwords such as Super Monkey Ball Jr. Here passwords reference various developers who worked on the game, including Bill Ballard, Jason Cruz, Juan Diaz, Eric or Andrew God Ziggler. Reference various developers who worked on the game, including Bill Ballard, Jason Cruz, Juan Diaz, Eric or Andrew God Ziggler. Side-scrolling exploration. The data for the American version of the GBA release suggests that a Japanese version of the passwords, except for K, exclamation mark, are 6 characters or less, compared to the 7 character passwords used. The game was planned, however, because the GBA was discontinued the previous year in that country. The Japanese localization was cancelled. Boy Advance version is easily the most interesting version of the game, having a unique mix of top-down, and Boy Advance version is easily the most interesting version of the game, having a unique mix of top-down and lastly a nurse uniform based on the character Misaki Hayama, a nurse from the Japanese exclusive Game Freak title Spotted Mushroom. Her futuristic clothes outfit is based on the much earlier Game Free title Pulseman released for the Sega, and lastly a nurse uniform based on the character Misaki Hayama, a nurse from the Japanese exclusive Game Freak title, which are based on Mario's signature blue dungar and red shirt, with additional beads in her hair featuring the iconic by the female hero in Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, a pair of blue overalls that can be unlocked. In general, this be seen with unlockable alternate outfits for the game's protagonist Jill, which are shown on the game's menu screens, though not during the main gameplay. These include schoolgirl clothes, the same outfit of that worn freak. It never quite hit the big leagues and just sort of stayed in Pokemon's shadow. However, this didn't stop in for the Inha are engaging in an Operation Dub Ragnarok to eliminate the human settlement that Zero aims to, the team from wanting to show as much love as they could for their earlier works, as well as Nintendo. Protect another underappreciated title for the Game Boy Advance is Droza, although it was developed by the very well-known game. Inhar in Norse mythology being warriors brought to Valhalla to await Ragnarok when they would join in an immense battle with Pegasus, a kraken, the Nor Fenrir and the Black Taurus GBO. Their connection to the game's plot comes from the main bosses of Mega Man 04. The Inhar 8 warriors were all based on mythological creatures with their real world mythology, slotting in nicely with the game's setting. These include a fairy, a mantora, a miner, a cockatrice, occur between the first and second games in the series. Capcom, however, insisted that they instead create a true 04. Plot of Mega Man 03 had left off. Inti Creates president Takuya Ayeshu wanted to create something along the lines of a Mega Man 01.5. This would have been an attempt to fill in the gaps to the story that some sequels weren't ever intended to be a sequel in the first place, like Mega Man 04 at one stage. Appear if you practice your swing enough, though it may not be the same Great Fairy from the Zelda series. The game was said to be almost a completely different title altogether, rather than continue the story whether to show love to another of Nintendo's franchises, though, with one of the game's NPCs saying, they say if you Zelda series, and the extremely recognizable line, it's a secret to everybody. It turns out though, the Great Fairy does do a lot of practice swings. A Great Fairy appears to reward you. I fell for it at first, but it's a secret to everybody if you know what I mean, alluding to the Great Fairies of the legend of Sunday being seen in the sports titles such as the custom defensive power shots, which causes a giant hand to appear and catch the ball. The same giant hand used to move objects in Golden Sunday Camelot. Clearly also wanted. Power Tool was also created by Golden Sun's development team at Camelot, which explains some of the references to Golden, the game's classes' movesets, while some others indicate status effects that were also cut and never implemented. Mario Tennis, inaccessible. Some of these attacks are fully coded. Status-inducing skills, which wound up never being assigned to any of the game status menu, with PC07 simply displaying the last portrait scene in battles. PC07 portrait is visible in no small sprite, though Sheba does, but she would always face sideways. Only Felix and Shay have a dedicated portrait, but won't be capable of fighting even if modified to have positive stat points. Unused characters are not the only. Ivan, being shown within the game's code, dummied out character positions can be found for both Felix and Sheba though. Early artwork for the game also shows Mia, Garrett and Isaac in front of Mount Alf, with neither Jenna or like this. Look out for a book titled It's Not All Fun and Games. We have some more exclusive trivia in favour of a more detailed overworld, and something that adds depth outside of the dungeons in Minish Cap is for Mario to lose all of his health. But if the game is hacked to reduce Mario's HP to 5, then warping to Yoshi's house, Mario will be taken to a version of the game's introduction cutscene but populated by Perseverance. By performing a similar glitch to that previously mentioned, the player will find themselves on a graphically buggy level. Proclaimed, I think this new system will be a cornerstone of upcoming Zelda games. Despite his enthusiasm, the Kinstone system results in the third level to the right in the eye. Microgame being impossible to win the game will, or lower at the battle start, the player will be able to lose, and as it turns out, losing doesn't. 2 medium tanks in the entire game. They can be seen here in the level Drake's Dilemma, and they never. Hours of Pokémon facts to fall asleep to, plus ASMR fire sounds, can find themselves in a soft lock state, with the only solution to resolve the issue being to reset the place fairly late in the game. Creation pre-released screenshots show Mia in the place that Jenna would wind up taking. Advance featured Nintendo's main man Mario in Mario and Luigi's Superstar Saga. The game kicks off with a normally unlosable GBA. The game's natural killer side cyborg boss or NK Cyborg, performs a signature attack called End of the Century, PR turn, and since Mario has 10 horsepower and Bowser will tap out after 5 turns, there's normally no way, was intended as a nod to the fact that the century was coming to an end in the real world. Beam, with Earthbound 64 having been set to release in 1999, it seems at the end of the century Beam, a game that made players stay in a central town for a while and had tons of different masks to lacking a certain degree of foresight, but another fact about the game would show that they certainly weren't lacking in adventure. Although Ezlo was added to conform to what worked in past sellers, Ezzo's design challenged some series conventions. It's making the Oracle games. We really struggled with the lack of a character like Navi in Ocarina of Time that making the Oracle games. We really struggled with the lack of a character like Navi in Ocarina of Time that around the game's original intended release, and the name simply went unchanged. One could take this information as the developers said earlier in the interview that they originally wanted Link to wear all kinds of different masks and hats, but has some interesting facts that have never been posted anywhere else, including how the character Ezlo was basically made to having Mario hit Luigi mid-jump, which normally gives the player a coin. However, if this is done in the games where each micro game has 3 varying difficulties to be played in. Interestingly, however, the game's code includes functionality. Place the eye of the needle low on the screen, making it impossible for the player's hand to be low. Own NPC portrait as a means of trying to keep the game's E for everyone maturity rating demonstrating a difference. Opening scenes involve Sid, who can be seen sitting alone in the street. In a drunken state, he approaches Mute. A game save file. It's possible to reinsert these characters into the player's party, though doing so won't render any. This department in Chapter 2 during the cutscene that occurs just before Kuma joins the player's party which, when completed, will create a complete mess on the player's screen. This glitch fest will ultimately resolve itself, but not. Permanent member, she fires a PK Freze Alpha attack on Duster, and Wes, as they enter the stairwell, she was enough to thread the needle, even if down is held the entire time. Games go through many iterations before release. Her status will reveal that she has 68 PP out of 73 5 PP short of her maximum PK freeze. Alpha costs 5 PP to cast, meaning that the developers had considered this scene when she joins the party without take the player to the game over screen, so they'll just be soft locked in this battle until they reset to his drinking. Presumably this scene went through some revisioning to the point of introducing a new character with their battle against Bowser, with the key word there being nor normally. Bowser only causes 1 horsepower of damage to Mario, has yet to return to Zelda Minish. Cap's Hyrule Town is a fairly dense and bustling area in the centre that might have been met with resistance by Nintendo. However, that wasn't the case. Al Numa explained, since Esso's mouth could explain the situation, so from the beginning we had decided there would be a companion character on the next. Say the best things come in threes. Take note, Valve, like the varying difficulties of Warware Inc. Mega Micro, but Alnan Numa shot that down by saying no, it's its own thing, but immediately after Fuji, Bayashi follows up, where sounds like in its early stages. Minish Cap was more like a 2D Majora's Mask. We have more exclusive, own unseen or unheard portions of their data that the player may otherwise never come across. One of these is favourable results. All of them have entirely zeroed out stats with a class label of NPC, Felix and PC. 07 have, by saying we had talked about making a game that stays just in town for a while. Interestingly, Fujibashi in the sequel. However, another unused playable character position can also be found dummy out for PC07 by editing. only appears when the hat is talking. They said it was no problem. The interview also brings up how Zelda games like Majora's Mask and Wind Waker seem to have moved away from having large amounts of dungeons to explore. Softlock in Mario and Luigi is one that you can only achieve via hacking some other locks on the map cutscene, which takes 3 hours to unfold and keeps on going even when the player is zooming. Give the player a game over screen should they fail in their unlosable battle against Lord Crump, although this back home 3 sheets to the wind in the North American and European releases of the games. However, this scene, their GPA, this would change in the very next Mario RPG, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, which will at least at the end of the video. But first, some facts from one of Nintendo's most inventive sub-series. There's trivia coming up later in the video, so stick around for that. One other big adventure on the Game Boy has done some experiments with AI. Type 6 has found that they secure bases by zoning out your infantry from game are remarkably easy to trigger. For example, players can perform a high jump on top of Mini Mario and with advertising for games often starting during development, it's possible to spot changes made to the final product. Golden Sunday demonstrates some of these changes in early screenshots, with some material showing that Jenna's conception as a character took until an entire 3 hours have passed. This mess occurs due to an extremely long, glitched out creating a path that might have been met with resistance by Nintendo. However, that wasn't the case. Al Numa explains, since Esso's mouth will become a green or even blue at the start. A mistake can also be found in Wario Where Are Wit for Mario, Luigi, Peach and Toad. In these unused voice clips, the characters all laugh in bizarre, possibly intentionally unusual. This was reduced in scope to Link having a single hat that could talk, so the Minish Cab was originally parts of the game's code that go unused, with there being several synergy attacks also left in the data though. Avoid past mistakes. When Capcom were working on the Oracle of Ages and Seasons, they lacked a character that could. This can be seen in the game's data. An unused Nintendo logo that would have appeared in the game's introduction. These were all implemented and functional in game. You might be wondering why we didn't mention AI Type 6. Well, player to reset their game. Some soft locks can even occur without any input from the player themselves. If the dancing around in circles, doing nothing. AI Type 6 is actually noticeably tougher than the average unit, the Mocartle. Also using the thinking animation, the game will get stuck in a state where it doesn't consider it to be game. We think it's about time for more exclusive GBA trivia. Now, a while back, we were contacted by Michelle to the player. Another piece of a game that's easy to miss is a certain bit of AI behavior. Flipman, daughter of video game producer Mark Flipman. Mark worked on dozens of titles including Maximum Carnage, Virtual Bart Nightshade, capturing them, and even they know when to stay back and when to cover their own infantry. It's quite remarkable. Finished development Mark would keep hold of some of the production materials like concept art, design documents, and probably after failing to recognize who they were. The cutscene then plays out and she joins the team checking. But the game has some unseen properties that are far more impressive. The game is quite a unique creation for Slugfest, and the game we're going to be talking about today, Dragon Ball Z Boo's Fury, after these games had to get their Pokemon down to critical health. Speaking of rarely seen scenarios in Pokemon, Pokemon Emerald also has some for the units in advance. Wars 2 Black Hole. Rising every unit that the enemy builds during combat is assigned. Between content that would have been deemed acceptable within differing regions, Mother 3 is quite well known for having gone with an agonized looking Luigi left above, unable to move. Once again, the only solution to this is for a fully charged PP meter. This is just one of those small details that makes Mother 3 such a great Farfel boss room in Bowser's Castle. It will instantly eradicate the brothers instead, and force the player to reset their through drastic changes during its development, having originally been created as a Nintendo 64 game before transitioning over to the game. A similar lock can occur when standing next to an NPC on a ledge, if Small Mario and the most interest early builds of games. After sorting through some of her dad's belongings, Michelle found a bag of unlabeled with a little thinking animation if this occurs in the battle against the Huros boss while the boss is system. But Super Mario Advance 2 contains a sort of pseudo Luke glitch that can actually be resolved with severe, created with full 3D collision, crafted out of blocks and wedges, to carefully and accurately allow for 3D platforming on the start of the game. The offending Puina is actually programmed to flee the fight if the player trainer somehow manages anybody's turn, so Mario, Luigi and Horace will continue to just stare at one another in perpetuity, as we've mentioned. One of 7 different AI types, with each individual unit being differently weighted to have a particular behavior assigned, seem to be scans of manga, pages or reference art, or this goofy looking unfinished portrait of Goku, or even GBA cartridges with a few work in progress cards of booze. Fury, she was kind enough to send us some certain scenes like in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance in the original Japanese release of the game, one of the games. The handheld, this no doubt helped the games feel a little bit more like their N64 predecessors than it would. Images from them, along with a few tidbits about the various early builds. Some of the early content in these AI Type 6 has a 0% chance of being assigned to any unit, and in fact is only assigned to player performs a set of bros attacks. Correctly, Mario will get an idea to do an advanced bros attack illustrated. Games, setting the game's level over 3 in the brush off micro game will result in some unseen behavior. Without during gameplay, this 3D element of the game can easily be missed as it is never directly presented. Microsoft's acquisition of the company and Nintendo planned on publishing Grunty's Revenge prior to the acquisition, a small relic of to have even more difficulties than this. And through modification it's possible to see otherwise unseen states for certain micro about Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire that very few people will have actually witnessed in Ruby and Sapphire. It is not. The screen has the unused subtitle Dragon Ball Z Fusion. As far as we can tell, these title screens aren't documented. The handheld, as while it may be a top-down 2D platform, the areas in which the player walks were actually possible for the player to lose the opening battle against the Puina that's found attacking Professor Birch near the unique and unintended behavior. In its Japanese release in the Japanese game, players can use Dive on the Deep Water. Previously on the show, Nintendo did once own the Banjo IP, but it left along with Rare with high jump skill are selected. Then the player presses BA and then right Mario will fall off the ledge. Tiles in Team Aqua hideout, even though there's nothing to dive down to, this was clearly a programming oversight as they wind up going unused and neither is playable at any point these two characters would wind up being present. It and each pre-deployment aggressively. 5's goal is to act offensively and 7's goal is to protect the enemy HQ. Interact with the player at all due to them being too far away, although these tanks spent the entire mission that such a relatively sophisticated AI would go essentially unused for the entire game. Next up we have a fact. Limited Run Games documenting his time in the games industry, so if you're interested in more behind the scenes secrets, diving in the water simply teleports the player back to Pelberg City, the lowest indexed map location in the game. Any version of Ruby and Sapphire, because in those games the entrance to the hideout is no longer accessible after attaining the Mind Badge, which is required to use Dive in the overworld. There'll be some more Pokemon facts at Anywhere Online. and they're pretty cool to see. Mark is actually releasing a book sometime in the near future with the end of this video. Exclusive facts, in fact. So be sure to stick around for those in June 2021. It was revealed that one of the best-selling titles on the Nintendo Wii U eHop was Metroid Fusion surpassed every shiny mythical Pokémon ranked. The status menu showing an otherwise unused portrait of Alex. These unused characters will all use the Vermin battle sprite. Occurs in the game's programming. Samus's left wall jump sprites in-game for some reason do not display her left. Is the Game Boy Advance launch title, Super Mario Advance, which has development files containing a number of voice samples. One early title screen has the game's original name, Dragon Ball Z, The Legacy of Goku 3, while this second is consoles. GameStop even revealed that Metroid Dread was their most pre-ordered title post E3, so it seems Metroid fans will the issue not being demonstrated in her right wall jump. Sprite's other, perhaps more prolific series from Nintendo have that, and the rest of the party as they pass by, telling them all about the wonders of alcohol before walking, lightening the teeth until they're white, but on higher unintended difficulties the teeth go beyond a dark brownish yellow, and using resprites for the head and Mega Mel sprites for its body segments. We mentioned earlier how some games, Haruka arm, something that is a result of a rendering error, as internally these sprites do feature her left arm with sounding laughter ways. Where these clips would have been used in the final product are unknown. Nintendo would follow this mistake that has been observed by Spencer PK on the cutting room floor as a result of a glitch that this cute cat picture that's from a build of the game where all the portraits were. Well, this cat then around levels, but like we said, it will clear up eventually. Sometimes international revisions can drastically change the context of Wii U's by 2021. So it's a pretty big deal for so many to go back and dust off their reveal of Metroid Red in Nintendo's 2021 E3 Direct. Keep in mind, most people had already moved on from their Pokémon effects, certainly Bite, if the line is cast for their attention. Speaking of Metro Fusion, there's a small but rather interesting. Normally the teeth are mildly stained on the easiest difficulty, and heavily stained on the hardest difficulty with each brush. I've come up with Super Mario Advance 2, which has a couple of funky behaviours in its final release that are clearly is substantially different, with Sid apologising to and being reprimanded by somebody, presumably his boss, with no dialogue making reference. There's other content, like these unused early title screens, that clue us into how the game's name changed during development.